sick and tired of hearing things from uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocrites. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. I've had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, big-headed politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth.
Welcome to CounterPunch Radio. I am your program producer, Nathaniel St. Clair, and today's episode is brought to you in partnership with Verso Books. For over 50 years, Verso has published important works of theory, history, philosophy, and criticism from the left. You can support radical independent publishing by shopping their catalog at versobooks.com. CounterPunch Radio listeners can save an additional 20% off their titles by using discount code CounterPunch at checkout. All right, on today's episode, Erik Wallenberg and Joshua Frank speak with Jeffrey St. Clair. You know him. He's been the chief editor of CounterPunch for 30 years now. And just 5 years after he took on that role, Jeffrey drove up to Seattle to join and document the WTO protests, or the Battle of Seattle, which were a series of anti-globalization protests surrounding the World Trade Organization's conference of 1999. Now, these protests blew up in a way that was shocking to most, certainly to the people and leaders attending the convention, including President Bill Clinton, but even to many of the protesters. So, Erik, Joshua, and Jeffrey speak about his experience there 25 years ago, what led up to and primed the protests to be so formidable and high-octane, and also what has happened in their wake. But before we get to that, I want to give you a quick look at the paid portion of our website and remind you that becoming a CounterPunch Plus member is the best way to support our publication. What you will find there isn't bonus content, it isn't fluff, it is first-rate, hard-hitting, investigative journalism. For example, this lacerating piece by Peter Bach titled Canterbury Tales, The Past Comes for the Archbishop. Here's a snippet. Voltaire once said of religion, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, was until recently leader of the Church of England, as well as ceremonial head of the vast global Anglican Communion. His resignation will take effect shortly, but news of his fall from grace has barely registered on a press landscape otherwise preoccupied with the U.S. election result and subsequent appointments. For those of you who missed the grim tale of the Archbishop, in 2013, he failed to report what he knew of the sexual abuse of underage boys conducted by a sinister barrister by the name of John Smythe, who in the 1970s and 80s ran various vicious Christian summer camps. Welby said recently, "When I was informed in 2013 and told that police had been notified, I believed wrongly that an appropriate resolution would follow." Now, this dereliction of duty meant that Smythe never got to face justice for his decade-long, prolific, brutal, and horrific abuse. Smythe died in Cape Town at the age of 75. Furthermore, Welby never had to confront the man he once described as a charming, delightful, very clever, brilliant speaker. What happens now in terms of a successor for Welby remains unclear, but it is hardly a deprived existence for any next Archbishop of Canterbury. They will enjoy the same exclusive central London headquarters as Justin Welby did. This is Lambeth Palace, a prestige riverside address and fortified place of informed prayer and vital communications, though not fortified enough, it must have felt in the chill of the guard room these past few weeks. End quote. All right, let's get to what you came here for. Erik and Joshua in conversation with Jeffrey St. Clair.
I'm sick and tired of hearing things from uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocrites. All I want is the truth. Just Just give me some truth. I've had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, big-headed politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth.
Welcome to another edition of CounterPunch Radio. I'm Erik Wallenberg, joined by my co-host, as always, Joshua Frank. We got a special treat for you all today. We've got Jeffrey St. Clair with us, the editor of CounterPunch. Jeffrey's the author of many books, including Ben Brown's So Long, Looked Like Green to Me. That's one of my favorites. Grand Theft Pentagon and The Big Heat, co-authored with Joshua. His most recent book is An Orgy of Thieves, Neoliberalism and Its Discontents with Alexander Cockburn. And today we are going to look back to 25 years ago. We just passed the 25th anniversary of the battle in Seattle, the WTO protests that erupted on the streets of Seattle on November 30th, 1999. Jeffrey St. Clair was there, and together with Alexander Cockburn, published a book with Verso on what took place over that period of time, titled 5 Days That Shook the World, Seattle and Beyond. Jeff, it's great to have you with us today. Welcome.
Hey, it's good to be here, Erik. Josh?
Jeff, it's hard to believe that Seattle was 25 years ago. I remember hopping on a van and heading up I-5 from Portland to join in on the fun. I was in college in Oregon then, but I didn't really know what I was getting myself into, and it was a very radicalizing event for me as a 20-year-old. Your dispatches, which became the book 5 Days That Shook the World, really captured the essence of those protests. But before we discuss what unfolded on those rainy streets of Seattle, let's talk briefly about what led up to that moment. Although it may have appeared spontaneous, Seattle's protests didn't really happen out of thin air. It was largely in response to years of neoliberal trade policies exacerbated by the Clinton administration. We were wondering if you could talk about a little bit of this and maybe explain to the listeners what the WTO was and why it was so hated.
Well, what I remember about the weeks leading up to Seattle is I didn't want to go because we had been through, 7.5 years of Clintonism, and almost all the protests had been big bust, a lot of build up and then fizzling out. I mean, if you remember, the thing that had really happened, I think, in the background of Seattle, beyond the neoliberalism, the trade deals, NAFTA, and all of that, was the war in Serbia. And there were almost no protests against that. It was the usual group of Quakers and Catholic workers and, a few radicals, but really, and the big standard bearer of the progressives had just entered Congress, Bernie Sanders, and he supported the war, which did spark some minor protest in his own office. He had, I think, Jeremy Brecher, one of his advisors at the time, quit. And what was Bernie's response to the protest outside his office? Call in the cops, have them arrested. And so that's what it had been like. For most of the progressives had just muted themselves during Clinton and Gore's term. One of the big things that had happened was Alex and I had gotten a contract to write a biography of Al Gore, and we had to get this book done in like 3 months. So taking a week out to go up to some, it had all the earmarks of being a parade, and the dominant theme really pissed me off, which was Teamsters and Turtles. I mean, it just seemed so manufactured by some PR firm back in DC that I didn't want to go. But at the last minute, I decided to, crank up the old Subaru and drive up just for the chance of meeting my old mentor, David Brower, who I just learned was going to be there. And that's really why I went up. I had no grand expectations. And, the first day was pretty much what I anticipated. And I was going to go back. There were speeches, there were white papers. The one interesting thing maybe was the emergence of the Independent Media Center, which was as I recall, it was like an old church or something. And so, that was interesting. The anarchists, though, and the Earth Firsters were much more creative because they put out fake editions of the Seattle Times. And so that was a little fun. It gave, it gave a hint maybe of what was going to come. But yeah, I was not all that excited to be there. But I did get a chance to meet Brower and then hook up with some friends from down south. And a lot of the contingent on the streets were people that, we knew because, I mean, Portland brought a lot of the former Reed College anarchists who had been putting on some wild demonstrations against particularly the Pappy Bush administration. And then you had the whole contingent from Eugene, which were maybe the sort of John Zerzan, primitivist Earth Firsters. And then you had a lot of the Northern California people who were coming up after Redwood Summer. And these were people who knew a lot about direct action. And the couple of days later, they put that to work out on the streets. But as for what came before, it was really George H.W. Bush's dream of the New World Order that he thought he was quite sure after winning the war in the Gulf that he was going to be able to impose upon the world, and then he got defeated by not just Clinton, but really people forget the campaign of Ross Perot, which was which was based on the sound that's sucking thousands of manufacturing jobs across the border. So I mean, the trade policies played a big role in taking down Bush, but they put into power an even more efficient, rhetorically gifted neoliberal in Clinton, who succeeded in silencing for years many of the people who were fierce critics of Bush when he proposed the same policies. So, I mean, that was, that's all in the background. So, the liberal groups just completely fell flat on their backs. You had the leaders of the environmental movement, people like the infamous John Adams, who was the head of the Natural Resources Defense Council, bragging about breaking the back of the environmental resistance to NAFTA. You had, I think, Alex and I called them the shameful seven, I think. There were seven of Gangrene, we call them the largest corporate environmental groups, who had signed off on NAFTA, largely at the, lobbying of the ozone man, Al Gore. And now there was resistance, but this resistance was, fractionated, grassroots people who were being put up against the wall, labor too. But at the top, it all seemed to be a grand complicity with the softer and gentler neoliberalism of Clinton. It wasn't at all softer and gentler. It was crushing to the manufacturing class workers. It was crushing to the aspirations of environmentalists, and but it remained latent really until it burst out on the streets in Seattle.
I love where you start that point on Bernie's having these activists arrested in his office in Burlington. I moved to Vermont just after that, fall of '99, right before the WTO protests. And some of my good friends, that was the story I came to in Burlington, was Bernie, the war apologist, the war enthusiast in Serbia and the former Yugoslavia. And I think of this as sort of bookended, right? Because what we get afterwards, after September 11th, and we'll get into that, but is that U.S. empire is always at the heart of these questions. And this is one arm of it, the WTO, trade policy. Take us through some of your article, because it is a fun read. I mean, you read this 5 days that shook the world. I think maybe at the time you called it something like "it's a gas, right?
Gas,
Right? People are getting gassed in the streets of Seattle. And just tell us a little bit about some of the highlights of your time there, running the streets of Seattle. I hope you'll say something too, just about what comes out of this, because you mentioned the fake Seattle Times, and I think of today, right, the New York war crimes that indie media is putting together, and CounterPunch, right, takes off as well. So yeah, tell us a little bit about that.
For us, we had been latecomers to the web. I mean, Alex and I were, both Luddites. It took it took 6 years to get him on a computer, and then it was like the tangerine colored dream baby machine of those first iMacs. I think his was, I don't know, pretty in pink or something like that. And he still, used, two fingers to type. But, up until the late 90s, it was all in his typewriter. And I sort of, I was on a computer, but, didn't really see the utility of the web coming, and it kind of had to be forced on us, thankfully. But that was really our first two ventures onto the web were the Serbia-Kosovo war, and then my dispatches from Seattle, and we just kind of threw them up because we didn't want to like give away, the investigative reporting we were doing for the print issue of CounterPunch, for free, despite perhaps our inner, socialist leanings. Because as Alex used to say, we're professional writers, aren't we, Jeffrey? There has to be at least a bottle of Jameson's out of this. Yeah, so what happened was I got up there in this, Josh knows this motel very well, called the King's Inn, which is just on the north side of downtown Seattle. And I think that back then it was maybe $55 a night. You can sort of envision, I think, the kind of clientele that regularly use that, sometimes by the hour. And I had my computer with me, but there was the Wi-Fi, I think, for most of the city was actually out a lot of the week. You could occasionally get it at the Independent Media Center. But so I went out, the first day and got some quotes, saw some people, pretty bored, came back and couldn't file anything. So I had to call Alex up on the telephone and dictate it to him. And I think he may have still been on he was on his computer by then. But yeah, so and then somehow somebody put it up on the web. It wasn't me, and it certainly wasn't Alex. So it may have been Becky. I don't know. Anyway, so it got up, and so we were rolling at that point. And I remember so Monday was a kind of a downer day. Tuesday, up early, down on the waterfront, and now you have something that looked like a demonstration in Europe somewhere. Maybe the World Bank protests that had happened, I think, was it 2 years or earlier? Was it in Prague? I can't remember, but there was a big World Bank demonstration, which was the first kind of flowering of what we know as the anti-globalization movement as an international movement that showed up at these gatherings of the G8 and IMF meetings and stuff like that. And boy, it was it was really kind of, I think, took them a little bit off guard. If you look back at the coverage of the New York Times, it was like violence erupts on the streets over the World Bank. Why the fucking World Bank? Why has that got people upset? Which is a good question, really, because it seems like a fairly abstract issue to draw thousands of people out onto the streets. But you had some really gifted organizers putting those streets together. I mean, this looked like a real European protests. There were big puppets and floats, and it had all the air of a carnival. And then there were and there weren't I think ultimately people said there were 50,000 people in Seattle for this. So you have to remember that there were two competing protests, I guess. One was less a protest and more about, a parade and a gathering of speeches by labor leaders. And then you had, the street protest. And I remember early on, there were, a couple thousand people probably out on the waterfront. And you had somebody, maybe from the Direct Action Network, saying, now, if you want to get arrested, get in this line on the left. And if you don't want to get arrested, but you want to be around those people who are getting arrested, take this line on the right. And I just remember still thinking this was kind of silly because I don't know if you know Mike Rozelle or not, but Rozelle's one of the more fascinating characters in militant activism in the U.S. He was co-founder of Earth First, but he was like at least a half a generation younger than the Dave Foremans and Edward Abbeys. He came out of the Yippie movement. But Rozelle was always like, fuck these designer arrests. If you're gonna if you want to get arrested, you have to be willing to pay the price for being arrested and like do something worth getting arrested for. Don't just surrender yourself to the waiting arms of the police and the the plastic cuffs and the paddy wagon. So that seemed a little strange to me. I immediately went with the people who were willing to get it. Not that I wanted to be arrested, but it seemed like, well, that's where the action was going to take place. I had my camera and just sort of followed them along. I forget the name of the character in Apocalypse Now, who just sort of floats through every scene through the first presented before him, a tiger leaping out of the jungle, French colonialist, Playboy bunnies dancing, skulls on stakes. He just goes through. I mean, that was kind of my attitude. That's kind of actually what I did, just floated from one scene to the other through the tear gas and the concussion grenades. But yeah, so that was a dividing point, another dividing point. You had the people who were going off to I forget what stadium it was being held in, so someplace downtown, maybe University of Seattle or something like that. So they were all gathered there to hear people like John Sweeney or Rich Trumpka or something like that. Had the Sierra Clubbers dressed in their turtle outfits, and
I imagine it was the Sonic Stadium, no? The sad now
yeah,
gone
yeah,
Key Arena. Yeah.
That awful place. But yeah, so and immediately there were lots of chants and songs. There was a siege engine that Mick Garvin and some of the Earth Firsters from Eugene had spent weeks building, which really looked cool. But of course, they rolled it about 20 feet or something and going to fall apart. I think they used the remnants of it as a barricade at one point against the assault by the cops. Yeah, so it had a carnival atmosphere that degenerated from there once the police decided to crack down. And the New York Times, I think it was maybe that would have been Wednesday's edition, immediately started trying to smear the protest. There was, I think, a front page story alleging that Molotov cocktails had been thrown at the police. They later retracted it, of course, 3 days later. But it was a total lie. I don't think there's ever been a Molotov cocktail thrown at any of these anti-globalization protests around the world.
And what day did President Clinton showed up?
Yeah, Clinton showed up. I think, remember the goal of the street activist was to shut the fucking thing down, which I think is great. There was a goal, and this is what we're going to do. We may not know what's going on in there, what kind of proposals Charlene Barshevsky, who was the U.S. trade negotiator, was making. But this was the goal. Shut it down. And Clinton arrived, I think, on Wednesday. He couldn't get into the city, and he gave a little press conference, on the docks, and tried to kind of wash his hands in a Clintonian way of the entire affair, and left. And ultimately, I think you had the street protesters outside. You had the African delegation inside, in particular, subverting the process from the inside, and the street protest on the outside. And, ultimately, it was shut down. I mean, it didn't shut down neoliberalism. It didn't shut down globalization. It didn't shut down the WTO. But for 1 week, they got counterpunched in the face, and the ruling class was taken off guard. You can only do that, every so often. They learn to adapt pretty quickly, and there were consequences. I mean, the next big demonstration was the IMF World Bank protest. And I couldn't get out to that because we were deep into the book at that point. But Joanne Wipajewski, who was, I think, the managing editor of The Nation at the time, but also Counterpuncher, went to cover that. And by then, the police were under orders to shoot to kill. So they'd adapted very quickly to these kinds of protests. And you saw it again in LA during the DNC. I mean, I was covering that for the BBC the final night and walked out of the final night of the convention to find all the protesters had been pinned in, and the LAPD were attacking them on horseback, just clubbing the shit out of them. Nobody could get out because they were all fenced in, which is, I think, the danger of agreeing to, like protest permits and protest zones, because you're not the one who are designing what the zone is going to look like. And in that case, people were just fenced in and were easy pickings. But it was an exciting week. But even within, and look, a lot of planning went into this. It wasn't just this kind of spontaneous uprising. You had behind the scenes the Direct Action Network were training people how to engage in nonviolent, direct action protests where you knew you might get the shit beat out of you by cops. You had the Ruckus Society, which was, John Sellers and his group, and they'd been training activists how to do tree sits, in Northern California, or how to stand up in front of, bulldozers way the hell in the middle of central Idaho, where no one is coming to your aid. And I think that a lot of the courage that was shown on the streets, first, it is an example of how to stand up to this kind of abuse. And then later, really taking it on the chin themselves, were from people who had McCulloch chainsaws as big enough to take down redwood trees thrust in their face. So they weren't going to be intimidated by the Seattle police. Now, it was a different story when the governor of Washington called in the National Guard for Wednesday and Thursday, I think. It got dicier then. That's when I remember, just getting blasted repeatedly by concussion grenades, within a foot of my head, tear gas, multiple sprayings of tear gas. I remember the first time it just being incapacitating, and then this angel, Earth First angel by the name of Osprey, comes to my rescue, drags me out off the street where I'm crying like a baby, wipes my eyes clean. I can see again, they're not burning, and she just like disappeared into the mist to go help someone else. And that's the kind of kindness, I guess, and experience within a civilian war zone that you just saw repeated instances over 2 or 3 days. And now by this time, the battle lines had moved out of city at night, in particular, out of city center up onto the Capitol Hill neighborhood of Seattle, where the police were tear gassing multi-million-dollar homes. And I think maybe the citizens of, the residents of Seattle who were like, what's going on out there, ended up having some empathy for the protesters once the cops started invading their neighborhood. And then the other element there was the Black Bloc. And they succeeded in really in getting under the skin of the I forget what was Medea and Kevin Danaher's group called as the globalization.
The 50 years is enough one.
Yeah, it's something like
part
that.
of that. Yeah.
But I mean, the Black Bloc, I guess, and others joined in, I think, started throwing, bricks through, I called it Sweatshop Row, which was, you had Nike Town, you had all of these boutique retail companies sort of down in the battle zone. And, like they broke some windows, and then some some local kids came in and liberated some shoes from Nike Town. And Medea gave this ridiculous press conference, saying how they had like sullied the protest and, it was shameful that there was looting taking place in downtown Seattle. I think maybe I don't think there's been an official retraction from her, but I think
Maybe you
that
could get that published in
was not her
CounterPunch.
finest hour. And and of course, then everyone started chiming in. I mean, the first window breaking. You could break as many heads as you want on the street, the cops could, but you break one window, and the entire liberal network of NGOs immediately turns on the protest. And we've overreached. The violent element has taken over and spoiled our protest. Um, and it just happened one after another. Carl Pope from the Sierra Club, even some of the union leaders, Sweeney. Um, and then David Brower, he's like 84 years old or something like that, comes out and defends the street protest. I think it may have been either one of the steelworker or longshoremen leaders came out and they had a joint press conference defending the street protesters. But that was a rare voice. Um, so, yeah.
Ultimately, the events changed everything, right? I mean, you had the Nader campaign for president erupt the following year, and a lot of us, especially us youngsters who were in college, saw this as the global justice movement going to the polls, right? And Ralph was filling arenas all around the country. I saw him at the Rose Garden in Portland. We tracked, as you mentioned, Gore down to LA for the DNC. It seemed like things were shifting and that these protests had come to life in a way. But I can't help but think then, just fast forward to 9/11, that which obviously was blowback for military interventions and our actions in the Middle East and elsewhere, but also blowback for the U.S. stranglehold on the global economy. And I'm wondering how you see this period after Seattle 99 and what went wrong with those movements, how maybe what went right with them. Were our hopes dashed or were they simply refocused? How do we make sense of the intervening Bush administration?
Well, I think, yeah, Nader had been working on these issues. Nader was there in Seattle. He had, I think, maybe even provided some of the funding for the Independent Media Center. And so he was flitting out, I think, and he was able to. I mean, now Ralph was even then, even in the 2000 campaign, a reluctant campaigner. I mean, he was not going to deviate from his set of issues, and it was up to everyone else to kind of build the movement around him, which I think they did remarkably well. Um, but then we always want to look at like consequentialism, because what didn't happen were these movements taking root within the Democratic Party. I think that's really the greatest failure. And you have to put the blame on, people like Sanders. Where was he? It's one thing to, it's a pretty despicable thing, but it's one thing to support the, Clintons. It wasn't just the war in Serbia that Bernie voted for. He voted 3 times for them to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and supported all of those, Clinton wag the dog, cruise missile shots. But you would have thought that he would have really run with this inside the Democratic Party on these trade issues. And he really didn't become an organizing voice for that because the election was coming up in 2000. And Bernie always, at least in the general elections, will coalesce around the home team. So it was left to Ralph. And, I mean, the Green Movement, was a force in many states. And I always thought Ralph should take credit for defeating Gore in Florida, New Hampshire. He didn't, Ralph being Ralph said, he lost his own state. He probably won Florida, but he wouldn't fight for it, which are all perfectly rational things to say, but they blamed him for it, right? They still blame him for it. Ralph, Susan Sarandon, and Jill Stein seem to have are the perfect excuse every time the Democrats um, lose an election. But there were consequences because it scared the election of Bush. Really scared a lot of the labor and environmental activists and brought them back into uh, the obedient tent of the Democratic Party. And then you had 9/11 happen months after that, and was just and then you're back to the Quakers, the Catholic workers, a few brave socialists out there, and Bush was going full speed ahead with all of these trade deals, WTO, global agreement on tax, trade, and tariffs, full speed ahead on all of that, and that there really wasn't much of an institutionalized force that you would have hoped would have been there after WTO in Seattle, to confront them. It wasn't there, and we entered into a kind of dark ages. But I do think that things ultimately, sprang out of that years later. I mean, you had the Occupy movement. I think the Tea Party movement, which I tried to relate to a little bit, because some of these people were from the early leaders of the Tea Party movement were from the Great Plains and the Midwest, the Farm Belt, which had just been eviscerated by consolidation, by these awful trade deals, by Monsanto. People forget what a huge rallying cry Monsanto was on the streets of Seattle. You had farmers coming in on their tractors from South Dakota and North Dakota and Montana. If you remember José Bové, the great French activist who'd taken his bulldozer to a McDonald's in France, he was in Seattle handing out Roquefort cheese in front of one of the McDonald's downtown with his bushy mustache. And yeah, he was one of the real characters that actually, after I reran my diary this weekend, I got a note from Jim Goodman, who was he writes for CounterPunch, and he has for many years, but he couldn't be there, but he was listening, I think, maybe to Amy Goodman's dispatches. And a friend of his, who I think was the director of Family Farm Defenders, was with José Bové as they were handing out the Roquefort cheese at the McDonald's. And it was just, it felt like, maybe we're onto something, this international movement.
Yeah, I think Seattle, I mean, it changed everything. Seattle 99 was it was a reset for a lot of people, but it was also an awakening. I was a freshman in college and just totally taken with like this whole world that I didn't realize existed. I think that was true for a lot of people. The WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, we followed that up with the protests against the IMF and World Bank in DC that spring. There was the free trade area of the Americas that came to Quebec, and that was a similar scene of people really partially shutting it down and then losing. But this traveled around the globe. Like you said, Prague, Genoa.
Genoa. You remember
Yeah,
Genoa, where I think there were maybe 500,000 people out on the streets, and they had pushed. I don't know if you remember this photo, but they'd pushed the heads of the people who were running the empire. That time it was the empire seemed to be run by Bush, Putin, and Bono. The three of them on some yacht in the harbor at Genoa. Don't let those bastards off again. Whatever you do. So no, it was hopeful. It was a sense that, finally, after, 7 years, they've, this latent movement has coalesced on the streets and risen up. And, the thing that's impressive is that it wasn't just one day, it was sustained over a week. And, that's pretty rare when you've, got the National Guard called down on you. Pretty rare in the States, something that can happen, twice a year in France, maybe. But, it was something new for us here. And it did energize a lot of people. And I'll say this, though, that my piece was not, universally admired. There are a lot of people who were very upset by it that I, besmirched and demeaned this coalition between organized labor and institutional environmentalism. In fact, I got a death threat, I guess, of sorts from one of our writers who was, I think, doing a life sentence at the time in a Washington state prison. He was a writer for one of the truly great publications, Prison Legal News, and he had written for us for years. And he wrote me this vicious letter attacking me for demeaning the protest that his girlfriend had gone to in Seattle, and she'd gone to down the parade and into the stadium to listen to the speeches. But so it took us a while to kind of repair our relationship, but no, I mean, yeah, it was, I think.
How do you feel now? You reran your diary last weekend, and people are revisiting this and talking about it. Do you feel like the dust has settled and history has been rewritten and looked at differently?
I guess I would have to say, what did we change? Globalization marches on. The WTO is still there. I, what I see a lot of, I mean, obviously, to be here just outside of Portland through the BLM protest, I saw a lot of Seattle in that. I mean, maybe way beyond Seattle, because they sustained those protests for what, almost half a year, every night, against the kind of brutality that we were seeing on the streets of Seattle. And I think Seattle was one of the first manifestations of just how militarized the police had become in the US. And it's one thing to see, them taking down Waco. I thought, a lot of, leftists should have been a lot more concerned about what happened at Waco, when you've got the FBI and the ATF, just bringing out, the Delta Force or whatever, and, burning down you know, a, a compound with, kids and women and grandmothers in it. Oh, those are right wingers. Um, there were, I think in Seattle, I mean, you forget Pat Buchanan endorsed the WTO protest. And that was his protectionist movement that had also was against the Middle East wars. So I think maybe there was some of those conversations took place on the streets of Seattle with some people that the left would not normally have talked to. Um, and there were very few protests against the war in Afghanistan, but and Alex and I spoke at a few of those, and those were mainly uh, put on by like antiwar.com libertarians. And we got a lot of shit for doing that. Well, how dare you speak with these right wingers? They're against killing people. We're both against killing people. Can't we talk in the same event? Yeah, but I think obviously the Occupy movement owes a lot to Seattle, and maybe some of the things that didn't happen in Seattle. I mean, there weren't like consensus circles on the streets of Seattle. There wasn't like time out. We're going to have a we're going to read a white paper and then we'll react. That was not happening the way it later did in Occupy. I mean, if the 2000 elections and 9/11 kind of smothered the movement that came out of Seattle, the election of Obama smothered the Occupy movement because he just completely, very easily co-opted it. What he didn't co-opt was the Tea Party movement, which took root. A lot of the same concerns. I think there was an anti-war element to the Tea Party. Definitely the trade deals, consolidation, NAFTA continued to be an issue with them. They were ultimately co-opted by the Republican Party, but they were a force, and then they reconstituted themselves into MAGA, I think. But we've yet to see those movements take place in the Democratic Party. I mean, it's remained through all of this has remained in the stranglehold of the neoliberals. And you just, I mean, they can lose elections, but they stay in power within the party. And I don't know if you saw the clip of Bill Clinton, I think it was last week, where he's leaning back in, his chair and he's going off in his typical pedantic, paternalistic manner about how, people out there, they don't understand that, people like us can go to work in suit and ties and that we know how, the world should be a thing or two about how the world should be run. They don't change. They're going to have to be evicted. And Bernie's definitely not the person to do it, because at every opportunity he's really had, he's fallen right back in line and taken his movement with him. So it's going to have to come from some other place, I think. I mean, that's, I guess, my big disappointment looking back 25 years. It's like, what have we gained? Is the world better now? Maybe it is in Mexico. Maybe it is in, Chiapas, where there was also a rising against NAFTA and neoliberalism that staked out some ground and held on to it. But
it seems here in the States, you bring up MAGA, Trump is echoing a lot of these concerns, right? His answers are obviously super fucked up, and tariffs aren't going to improve things. But he's speaking to a discontent that's there, that's been there, and he's exploiting it with hate and all of those racist things, of course. But the Democrats haven't responded to this and aren't able to respond. And I don't know if there's going to be a reckoning there or not, but there needs to be, right? And
yeah, there needs to be
a lot of it dates back to Seattle in a lot of ways.
A lot of it, yeah, a lot of it. Well, it just, I think what the Democrats should have learned was that there's a lot of anxiety and anger, and they've never really tapped in. Obama did tap into the anger against the Iraq War, but he never tapped into the anger against, NAFTA. Now, you would have every Democratic platform, yeah, we're gonna, put, more environmental sidebars and, labor sidebars on NAFTA. Trump was like, get rid of it, and then what did he do? He passed NAFTA too. But it was he had at least had his pulse on the anger that was simmering across party lines about, these interventionist wars and about these trade deals that were behind the destruction of the working class. And the Democrats are like, it's not as bad as it seems. It's, look at the stock market. It's doing great. Shit, I looked at there's a listing of houses for sale now in Los Angeles County under $1 million. And there were a total of 496 of them. Something's wrong. And we're still waiting on that, sort of progressive leader to pick up the pieces and the thread. I want to say something about Alan Sekula. Well, maybe how the book came about, because at first were these dispatches, which were different than what became the Seattle Diary, but that Alex put up every night on the website. And then the diary appeared in the New Left Review, where it was seen by one of the Nader-like people, that kind of stature, this Ernie Fitzgerald, who had been a Pentagon whistleblower. He blew the whistle on, the $50,000 toilet seats and stuff, and won a called a qui tam action, for exposing this deep corruption. And he put all of that money into I think it was called the Fund for Investigative Journalism. And so I get a call from Ernie, and he goes, Jeffrey, you got to put your diary into a book. It's got to be a book. And, here's like, we'll pay for the printing of it. Here's like $3,000, pay for the printing of it. Will that pay for the printing? I don't know. But so anyway, we put the book together, and then a great photographer, Alan Sekula, LA based, and he had been photographing demonstrations around the country, and I think some in Europe as well. And he had some great photos of Seattle. I went down to Los Angeles to meet him, and we both went to the Ramparts division, which the notorious Ramparts division of LAPD, just known for the daily and nightly brutalization of the Black community, and went to a very contentious demonstration outside of that. He took me back to his studio, and he put together a suite of photographs for the book, which are great. The book comes out, and I get a call from Ernie Fitzgerald, who'd gotten a copy, and he goes, "Jeffrey, what the hell did you do to the book? There aren't enough pictures of the police brutalizing people on the streets of Seattle, you know?" And it's true, there weren't. But I said, "Ernie, do we want people to come to protest in the future if all they see are cracked open skulls and broken noses and, 14-year-old girls gasping for breath from the tear gas? I don't think they're going to be out in the street." Alan's photos are really photos of solidarity under enormous pressure. And, they're great. He died a couple of years ago, very tragically, of cancer. But I was very happy to have his photographs in the book.
I think the book can be hard to come by. So I encourage people to go out, find it used at a good used bookstore. And
do you have a box of those?
Yeah, they can come by Oregon City here. And
whatever publishers might be listening here, help us bring that one back into print for the photos and the dispatches alone.
It did end up being printed in Turkish and Greek, I think, which was odd. Yeah, so that was...
Hey, maybe it had an influence in some of those protests, huh? I wonder if you might just say one last word about what some of our listeners who didn't live through this history, don't know this history so well, if you have any other favorite books, accounts, documentaries. I think of the documentary, This Is What Democracy Looks Like, as capturing quite a sense of that moment in history. But this history is really important, I think, to what comes after, as we've talked about. And so maybe you have any other recommendations to share.
Yeah, there's a documentary that I saw. I think it's called 24 Frames a Second in Seattle, something like that, which is, of course, comes from Godard's line about truth at 24 frames per second. It's very good. There was, I think there's one called The Battle in Seattle, which was another sort of first-person account of being out on the streets during that week. Can't remember the author of that. And then if you go to the University of Washington's library archive page, there are fantastic photographs that just taken by people out on the streets. A lot of the posters, I used a few of them in reprinting my diary this weekend. And I think all of those came from that online archive. Many of the anarchist papers, because you may have caught the ruling class off guard, but there was a lot of hype in the radical environmental newspapers, Earth First Journal, and some of the anarchist papers about, what was going to happen and what the goals were and how it was going to shake down.
But it's interesting too, I think, to think about 99 as it's the budding of the internet era, but people still communicating analog, right? I mean, we weren't texting everybody and sending, so things were being organized offline, and maybe that's a sign of what needs to come, right? A little bit
easier to take them off guard that way. But yeah, I mean, it's always going to stay with me. It changed me, and not just in destroying my hearing. It was, I was there with a group of friends, and we went through it together. Some didn't go quite as far as others. But to have a generation that went from David Brower, who was in his 9th decade, to some kids up from Humboldt who were in their teens, and that force united together out on the streets was very impressive. And
it's also, for me, I think about it bookending the 90s. You have the beginning of the 90s really, at least pop culture wise, happening in Seattle with the so-called grunge movement, and then you have the end of the 90s happening with this head cracking on the streets. It's pretty
well, and so if it begins with Nirvana in Seattle, a new movement was born in LA with Rage Against the Machine and the Battle of LA, if you want to look at it in that respect.
Do you have any stories about that before we wrap up of LA? I know that there's some famous gossip.
Yeah, I mean, I remember the fun. Well, Coburn was not one for going to demonstrations, which meant that I had to go out to ramparts, and I covered both, like the demonstrations in LA as well as inside the convention. But I remember him getting into tweaking. I don't know if you remember Mark Cooper, who was a columnist for The Nation or writer for The Nation, who had actually insulted Laura Flanders for some reason, who was, of course, Alex's niece. And Alex confronted Cooper on the streets of LA in the midst of this throng of cops, and I think punched him in his very substantial gut, and he like ended up on the street. And then he got up, and along came Alex's brother Andrew Coburn, and Cooper was going, "Did you see that? Did you see that? Coburn just punched me." And Andrew just went up to Cooper and tweaked his nose. Total humiliation. It's pretty funny. So I guess Alex did have some confrontation, but he definitely didn't want to be near any tear gas. But yeah, I mean, LA was raucous, and it was a different scene than Seattle, but it was another rising up against the Democrats, which was impressive. You didn't see that again for a while.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks so much for joining us to recap
Fun.
25 years since the WTO protests in Seattle. We really hope that you can come back on and continue to share your thoughts over the next few years as the Trump administration's whatever the fuck's to come.
Billionaires for the common man.
Well, we'll hope to have you on again when we talk about the next Seattle moment, which is hopefully not too far off in our future here.
Let's hope not.
I'm sick and tired of hearing things from uptight, short-sighted, narrow-minded hypocrites. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. I've had enough of reading things by neurotic, psychotic, big-headed politicians. All I want is the truth. Just give me some truth. Short-haired, yellow-bellied son of tricky dickies gonna mother hubbards off so be with just a pocket full of hope. It's money for dough.